we're excited to have Bobby Gorczakowski from OUTFRONT Media here today with us. He's a research analyst at OUTFRONT Media, and just want to make note of that. With these sessions, we do want to make sure we're getting a broad breadth of the industry. So we do want to do use cases with operators, with agencies, but also different roles within the different members. So we're excited to have first time to have somebody from the research role within an operator. And again, just want to give Bobby a chance to say hello and tell us about what he does at OUTFRONT.
Yes, well, thank you, Scott and Brian, for letting me join the call today. Very excited to be here. But yeah, at OUTFRONT, I'm on our research department or research team. So we handle a variety of different things, but largely we are helping our sales teams with guiding their media recommendations and media planning, whether that be through different types of data, reporting, heat maps, etc. So kind of help guiding that discussion, but also, definitely leveraging Geopath data. And we tend to be pretty in the weeds with the different metrics, which I know we'll get into later today. So I think this will be a good chance to.
So for example, if a RFP comes in the door, a sales rep may reach out to you and ask for help with that. Is that how?
Yeah, depending on what the RFP entails, different data points they might need. If it's a demo, if it's a POI targeting, we might help with some of that information. Not every RFP crosses our path, but we do see a large part with national and local buys, different types of clients and industries. So
cool,
wide range.
Cool, great. And you also reminded me that I did this again. If you do have questions, please ask them in the question widget in the Zoom module. And also I do want to introduce Brian. He's always here with me, Brian Schopper, who did a great job with the walkthrough yesterday. So thank you and welcome as well. And he'll be here with us monitoring questions and making sure we're not missing anybody's questions that come in. So want to jump into the use case. So this one, as we were talking and trying to develop the use case with Bobby over the course of the last few weeks, we realized, we wanted to focus on a different category. And we also wanted to, one of the key things we also want to talk about is the idea of marrying the data with local market knowledge, because there's a lot of data that you can pull from Geopath Insights now. But there is a tremendous amount of local market knowledge that our members all have. And we want to make sure that we're highlighting that really helps in the decision making. It's not just the data driving and being the sole decision maker. There's an art and a science to it. And that's part of what we want to also talk about on today's use case. So just a little bit of background and research that we did and to set up the use case. So this is about, as I said, a new luxury fashion brand called Maza, and you may never have heard about it, but that's because it doesn't exist. So this is a made-up brand that we want to use to help demonstrate this use case. Not that we're not going to tie it to reality, because we are setting this up as a new brand. They want to establish themselves in New York City and other kind of markets around the country, but specifically New York City. And they're a brand that's going to compete with Gucci, Prada, focusing and trying to reach that really young, trendy urbanites across the market. And to do that, we wanted to do some background research and really understand what research is out there about what's Gucci doing or some of the other brands, or how do they define this target? And this is a step that, if maybe the agency, if this RFP came directly to an agency, maybe they would be doing this, or maybe Bobby, if it came to OUTFRONT, maybe would it be reasonable that you might be doing this to, especially since it's a new brand, helping them understand their market and things like that?
Yeah, our teams, if we are working with the client directly, they definitely want to have almost like a discovery meeting and really understand their campaign goals, their demographic, target markets, etc. And yeah, so this could be both from an agency or
right. So either side. So this is some pre-work that may be done, and we wanted to replicate that. So we went out there and did some of that research and saw like where Gucci's going. And so they're really focusing on a mix of demographics and psychographics. So that's really key for us as we were starting down our path to really understand this case study. And they're very selective in their targeting strategy. And so again, felt both of these factors really tied in nicely to our Maza brand. and really help guide the kind of audience selection, so to speak. And so, again, further information we were able to find was, the segment should consist of high income, high status, trendy consumers, and even found this customer segmentation slide. So looking at a range of ages 20 to 50, who buy products that's, they want to be on trend, and also look at quality. So again, all qualities of an audience that seems like it would be appropriate for our new brand. And so we did some research and we looked at all the different audiences available and really settled on the one called Prism Premier segment called Young Digerati. And we thought this was really great because we haven't had a chance to really talk about these Prism Premier segments much on these use cases. And so we wanted to do that today. So this Young Digerati, and you can pull this right out of the Insight Suite. They're tech savvy, live in fashionable neighborhoods on the urban fringe, affluent, highly educated, and you can see their age range kind of fits with the target, and again, fairly affluent in their median household income as well. And so that leads us to our actual, the use case details. So I want to kind of just set out the example of the use case. So again, client, the high-end fashion brand, Maza, talked a lot about this already. So they want to target a young audience of trendy and fluid individuals. And then they want to be very selective in their buying, opting for high-impact placements in fashionable, trendy neighborhoods and high volume areas to create awareness. So Bobby, when you see something like this, like what is your first reaction?
Yeah, there's definitely a few things I think that stand out right off the bat for the operator, knowing one, the high impact placement. That kind of is a little subjective to understand what is high impact. Is that going to be high impression counts? Is that going to be a high reach in the market? Or could that be just a high percent comp index of the board? So, that your board is really a good quality of reaching your audience. So that's obviously, we'll get into that in a little bit. But the other thing too is the fashionable, trendy neighborhoods. And as you mentioned, there's definitely a lot of local market knowledge that comes into planning for out of home. And right off the bat, in New York, especially fashionable areas, you kind of think Soho right off the bat. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting to see what the data shows when we start pulling this to see if that kind of reaffirms Soho or if there's new opportunities within the market that maybe were overlooked. So those are two big standouts. Of course, understanding which formats they're interested in, the market and the target. At the same time, too, maybe if we find that other media could over-index for a target, there might be an opportunity to have that discussion. But for the purposes today, we'll stick to bulletins and walls.
Okay. Yeah, and we're looking at bulletins and walls, and in your mind, does that kind of speak to high impact in a certain way? Just because of the type of inventory that it is?
I mean, granted, it's the size of these formats is definitely impactful. They definitely yield larger impressions than most other formats, given that they're both static too, kind of getting that constant exposure within a market.
Right.
But it really depends on where an operator is placed in a market. Sometimes other formats could be more premier for them, but thankfully at OUTFRONT, we do have a nice coverage in New York, and I think our bulletins and walls are in a bunch of areas that we could worth targeting.
Great, cool. So obviously New York DMA, and we started looking at target impressions first. And so we pulled the top 25 units based on target impressions, and just to see where they are in the market, and wanted to just, as we go through and dig deeper into that, you see where we've kind of highlighted the circle where they're mostly clustering, and you see the Port Authority, Times Square, Herald Square, Penn Station, and any thoughts on that as we were kind of working through pulling this data together?
Right. I mean, right off the bat, high impression boards, you kind of are skewing to a Manhattan area most likely, and regardless of the target. But this target also should confirm that there's a large cluster in the Midtown Manhattan Times Square area. Obviously, these points of interest are big hubs for either people to visit or to come into the city. So Penn Station, Port Authority, big transit hubs, the retail hub of Herald Square. That's where the main cluster was, but there are even a few units down in the meatpacking area in the bottom left that could be of interest. There's a wall, looks like right by the Midtown Tunnel, and there's even a bulletin by the Queensboro Bridge, also arteries into Manhattan. So might be stuff that we kind of already assumed, but it's interesting to see that it does skew more into the Times Square, Midtown West area.
Right. And you made a good point too, because we were looking at the DMA, and the New York DMA is not just Manhattan, as much as we might like to think about that it is living in Manhattan, but it is other parts of the tri-state area, so to speak. So it is a good point that, they are making note that they are kind of clustered in the New York City area. So that was also another interesting finding that we thought, because we thought we might see a little bit more out maybe near Short Hills or things like that, again, knowing the market, but this is what we saw. And then the next thing we looked at is reach, and reach is always interesting, I would gather, from your perspective. So any just initial thoughts as we're, so this was the initial poll. Again, we did the same thing, again, more for comparison. So we looked at the top 25 based on a target of reach. And we'll just show where they are showing up right here across the market area.
Yeah, so we still see a lot of similar arteries throughout the market. A lot of, looks like a cluster in Midtown Manhattan, which is kind of similar to the target impressions. It does seem that there's a bit more dispersion with these units, which I think is very important for reach. Obviously, you can have a lot of impactful boards in Times Square, but you're reaching pretty much the same audience with each of, or similar audiences with each of those boards. Versus here, we have a unit up in the Bruckner Expressway, which might be good for targeting like a Westchester or Connecticut crowd traveling in. You see we have a few arteries within Brooklyn and Queens, and kind of all leading into Manhattan, where we have a handful of units too. So it's definitely going to be important to have some disparity in the market when you're trying to go for a reach goal, if that is what high impact might mean for that particular client. But it's interesting to still see there's a lot of overlap too with the impression list.
And when you're focusing on reach as a metric, it feels like there's a lot more to do with it, right? You probably wouldn't just take this. It looks great. It's dispersed more so than the other target impressions, but that's not where you leave it, right?
Right. Yeah. Reach is definitely a trickier metric to plan for, just because you can't just add the reach together. It's a duplication issue there. But with impressions and TRPs, you could just combine those for the units in question. So this would be something you kind of have to play around with and see, maybe we want to not use all the units in Manhattan, or focus on other, maybe the top 50 then, to kind of see like a larger pool of units to pull from and play around with. But given some of these, like the Bruckner Expressway unit, looks like that's probably a more unique reach to some of these other units than a Queens Midtown Expressway or a Belt Parkway. So this does lead a good conversation and guides you in the right direction, but it does take a little trial and error too.
Okay, so this is literally just the starting point if you're working with reach.
Right, exactly.
Okay, and then also looking at the reach poll, still showing up with some units in those major hubs within the city, so Penn Station, Port Authority, Herald Square near Macy's, Times Square, etc. So again, that's something you would have expected, or does that speak to you in any other way?
That area of Manhattan and New York in general, it's definitely a high traffic area. So of course you're getting a lot of people coming in from either the Connecticut, Westchester, largely on this west side would be more New Jersey. It could still be Long Island targeting, and then obviously the 5 boroughs. So it's understandable that these are going to be high reach units. I guess if we had a reach goal to plan for, though, we probably wouldn't want to choose too many within this area for that same disparity reason that we were just speaking to.
And also too, that's another good point you brought up. I'd mentioned just a moment ago about, the DMA is large, and, maybe we might have expected some units to be in New Jersey, but to your point, we are reaching people from those markets already, right? Because of how people travel and how people move across the market and the DMA itself. So that is a good point.
It definitely wouldn't hurt to have units maybe in New Jersey if you were kind of planning for the DMA as well. But to what you just said too, it's the audience might be traveling into the city as well, and you're targeting them right here with these same units.
Cool. All right, so the next metric we looked at is target composition. So looking at that, and again, on these webinars, we often talk about composition as kind of that level of efficiency in reaching your audience. So this is where we this is what the top, again, for comparison, we looked at the top 25 units based on target comp percent and saw a different distribution, slightly different distribution within the market.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, you see we're kind of losing that Midtown West, Times Square area concentration of units, and now we're seeing a little bit more downtown, which I think we'll get to in a sec. But even in the units in Brooklyn, I found interesting that they seem to be a bit more on local roads versus the major highways and major arteries surrounding or passing through Brooklyn. So when you're going through percent composition and percent comp index related, they could be a very different story. Still worthwhile and still very effective in targeting. Again, these boards will have just a high target impressions compared to their total impressions. So there's really maybe less waste, you could say, on these units on visibility. But if you are looking at maybe a CPM goal, the target impressions might be your conversation point. So it is interesting. But the cluster that we are seeing here, it looks like it falls, and I think on the next slide we go into that, it's more into the Soho area, which is kind of where we thought that local market knowledge was going to lead us in the first place. So again, it's using the data to kind of reaffirm the stuff that we already know, getting some metrics behind it, as opposed to any sort of assumptions that could be made. But obviously there are a lot of fashion brands that advertise down in this area already, and obviously based on this slide, there's a lot of luxury stores or luxury clothing stores in this area. So it makes sense that it has that location proximity that out of home is great with providing, but also kind of confirming that with audience-based data as well.
Right. And if you were on the session yesterday, this slide here, all those points of interest are some of the competitive stores, brands that have store locations that might be, competing with our brand Mazza. And then, so we looked at 3 different metrics, and now it's to like comparing the where they are and comparing the actual metrics, where we start to really understand kind of the results here. So this is the inventory set based on target impressions, and so they're in green, and we're going to layer in all of the other inventory sets as well. So this was adding in the inventory based on reach, and then we're going to add in all based on the target comp. So as you look at this map here, Bobby, any initial thoughts? I don't want to put you on the spot, but anything that's speaking to you when you see this set of how they're each very distinct, right? And what they're doing.
I mean, as we saw with the initial polls, it looks like there was some more overlap with the reach and impression lists, but there still is some disparity between those lists, and obviously the percent composition list being most unique compared to the other 2. We do see we have a New Jersey unit, so that kind of helps tell that story, as well as the other outer boroughs that we were looking at. What I found interesting too, which I noticed in the Excel list that Brian was so nice to send to me, I actually noticed that there was actually one unit of ours that fell within the top 25 of all three of these lists. And I found that interesting just because, it looks like target impressions, target reach were yielding more unique units, but then along with composition, there was that overlap. And I think that really tells like that particular unit might be a really effective unit for your client because it kind of hits all the check boxes. Not that the other units may under index or not index as high, but that was a nice marrying of all 3 metrics. And I think that's the best story we could probably offer. It's if it kind of checks off multiple boxes, multiple metrics. And so I found that just a little interesting. I know we can't really see it from this map. They're probably all overlapped, but it was just something that I wanted to dig into, and it was an interesting insight. But taking units from each of these lists too, we could get some nice disparity across the market. We have, Midtown, downtown Manhattan. We have the Brooklyn and Queens. There was that unit up in the Bronx, and then the New Jersey unit. So it kind of marrying the 3 lists will be a very nice approach, and I think probably one of the better plans we can offer, factoring in, availability, costs, and stuff like that.
Gotcha. I just want to check, are there any questions?
Yeah, we had a question. It was actually just about if you could go and reiterate what each of these colors were. We don't have a key for this, but if you could just go back and just kind of.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so comparing the inventory set. So the green were the target impressions. So that was the first set of units we went through, and then we're layering in the target reach. So again, that was the second set. And then the third was target composition. So I'll flip through that again just to, a little slower. So target impressions, green, target reach, blue, and target comp, red. And then we looked at the metrics, right? Because those are all very important as well, right? That's what we want to how we base. There's the geography, there's the distribution, but then there's also the performance, right? So we have a comparison chart that goes across those three major metrics that we across three major metrics for the three inventory sets that we pulled. So, and you could, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, as I kind of mentioned earlier with my particular role at OUTFRONT, we kind of a little bit more in the weeds on the data side. So I definitely like diving into this stuff. We'll see here, obviously, target impressions are yielding the highest target impressions, which is not surprising. The target reach units were a lot in the similar areas as the target impression units. So those impressions are pretty close, which is, again, kind of on par with what we were seeing visually. It is interesting, though, the target composition units had a little bit more of a drop in impressions. But if you look at their comp index, these are much more favorable in regards to targeting, at least by an index metrics, targeting this particular audience. So it really comes down to, maybe what are some of the driving metrics that the client will want to see. Again, if it was more of a CPM conversation, you would maybe look at impressions. The reach goal would be important to kind of get that disparity in the market. But maybe a high index is really the most compelling story for a client and understanding what are the best units for them. And the other interesting thing I found here too is that even the target impressions and target reach boards, although they weren't based on index, they still have pretty high indexes as an inventory set. So that might be a nice marrying of the two metrics there to understand that these are pretty favorable boards to use. So a lot of different options we can kind of go into. I mean, of course, these were all 25 unit lists and there was some overlap. So we might be looking at roughly 50 to 60 units. That may not obviously be a realistic amount of units that a client would buy. So we might just see what are then the top performing ones, maybe in each inventory set.
So you would typically pick from maybe like a list, starting with that list and narrow it down?
I mean, in this example, because we kind of just at high impact, we would maybe picking from all three lists would be important or beneficial, but it really depends on what's the client's campaign goal and what are they going to find to be high impact. So that might be another question or a conversation to have with the client, or if we kind of take our own liberty and try to build this our best recommendation, then maybe we do a mix of the three.
Okay.
And of course, there was that one unit that hit all three lists, which I think was definitely something worthwhile then to focus on. Ironically, it was a unit not in Soho, which we might know, so that might be a new opportunity unit for some of these luxury fashion brands.
And that's interesting too. I wonder, having the ability to now look at these types of audiences for inventory for different units, it maybe helps you kind of define a personality for that unit, maybe more so than you could in the past, I guess. I don't know. I'm getting at just understanding other audiences that it might be good for that you might not have even thought of.
Yeah, I mean, all the new Geopath data and the Insight Suite is great for both sides. The media planning aspect of it, where we kind of say what are the highest indexing or highest reach impression units, but also on an operator side, we can kind of tell this personality story, like you mentioned, of a board, and maybe tell more of a story around that as opposed to, and try to sell that specifically as opposed to always incorporating it in a plan of metrics. Or a lot of clients might have perm units and they might want to know a little bit more about, something that they've bought in the past and understand the full profile and what index is high, so that data is available.
Yeah, and I guess that could impact communication, right? Do I change my messaging throughout the year, knowing that maybe certain audiences are also passing by this?
And that is something I'm sure for the industry it's big, but especially at OUTFRONT, we definitely push for important is creative, regardless of your placement, which is also an important part of the buy. You want good creative, so with your messaging. So if you're finding that your audience might skew a certain way, maybe you adjust that messaging to a certain whatever that may be, whether it's just visually or the copy. But inventory plays a large part of this. So we have the mix of the audience-led data. We have the location base with near those stores, and then we have the creative. I think tells a really compelling story for a client.
Cool. So as we're finishing up, I just want to check and see if there are any other questions that are being asked.
Yeah, it was not exactly a question. It was more so a comment. It was the matter of availability, and I guess that this is just kind of in a way this is like a jumping off point for making this into a real campaign. You know, of course, not everything is going to be available, but
right. I mean that. What I was saying earlier too, like this might yield maybe 50 or 60 unique units, given the overlap. That would be something that an operator like ourselves would have to address internally to understand what is available for the time frame they're looking for. And then also, obviously, pricing comes into play where, you know, all these high impression boards might in fact be some of our maybe highest cost boards, in which case, you know, we wouldn't want to, that may not be favorable for a client.
Maybe for a new brand starting out, maybe they can't,
you know, maybe an entry level into the market. And as they expand, they might be willing to go for those higher boards. So, I mean, every client's different. It's not that has to be the case, but it is something that, you know, availability and pricing is something that's factored in every scenario.
Great, cool. Well, again, we'll a couple more housekeeping things before we finish up. So if you do have any last minute questions, please let us know. So our December, and I have it in quotes, December Insights training sessions, given the holiday and the end of the year, we're actually going to do our December sessions in the first week of January. So January 7th, we'll do our foundational one, and January 8th, we'll do our advanced level session. And what we're hoping to do with that one is actually take another look at this use case, but from an agency side and maybe even a different market. So that's what we're planning for in early January. So we're excited about that. And again, if you missed yesterday's session or if you missed any of the other sessions, you can always go to our website and go to the Geek Out tab and scroll down to our Out of Home Office Hours. From there, you can access the most recent ones as well as our entire YouTube channel of webinars available. So one last check.
Yeah, we got a question. It's actually a really interesting one. I'm going to bring my computer over.
Okay, so we just have one more question coming in, and Brian's going to read it off to us.
Once you check availability from the total units you were looking at and taking into consideration, do you take the available units and then bring them back into the Insight Suite and recheck metrics again? So would you, once you've netted it down, would you rerun the metrics on that specific group of units again?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends, because if you're looking at maybe just a total target impressions or a target TRP, you know, metric, those are additive. So that's something you can kind of just see what's available and add those up. If you're looking at a target reach goal, that would be something you would have to rerun into the in the Insight Suite to understand what is that new metric. But there are you know, if the order of steps could be different by each operator. I mean, this is something where you can maybe start with what we did here. Maybe you want to start by just seeing what are the available units and then kind of running like what are the highest indexing or highest impression. Every operator, I'm sure, is going to be different in that and how they handle that. But whatever's the easiest or the most straightforward workflow, it would make the most sense. But yeah, there's really no definite answer to that. I guess it kind of depends on a case-by-case scenario, but especially for a target reach goal, that would be something that we would
definitely have to go back in and rerun
based on the subset of units that we ended up selecting.
Cool. Well, again, I do want to say thank you. It looks like one more last question came in again.
We're getting some really good questions. This one says, with larger population markets like New York, do TRPs matter less?
That is an interesting question. I think that still comes down to, at least from what I've seen, and you know, maybe I'm not necessarily having conversations directly with the clients on these, but I do feel like that is a client preference.
Yeah, would it depend on the client? Like, are they TRP? I know, just again, working with a lot of our members and fielding questions that they have for us. I get the sense that like TRP, some clients are TRP driven, some clients are whatever, you know, reach driven, target, you know, impression driven. So I
mean, looking at the comparing of the sets that I think is up on the screen right now, like it's interesting that if you went for the TRPs against the target composition units, the inventory set, since the target impressions are much lower, you wouldn't see as many TRPs for that. But if index is more of the compelling story there, that might kind of
Right.
take a
Right.
be more important for
Right. And I guess in a larger market, it's a little harder, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a little harder to get a higher TRP number, right? Because you have to,
yeah, I mean, obviously the
you
New
need
York
more
DMA
inventory.
being as massive as it is, it's definitely a large population base to be comparing against. But you know, and obviously too, the thing to note too with the target impressions, even though those are higher impression inventory sets, you know, this could be, and maybe not this example, whatever profile point you're using in the Insight Suite could be fairly niche, in which case you're going to have a smaller impression count. Also, you know, your population count would go down within the DMA, but yep, you know, there's a lot of things changing kind of when we apply a target and how that story goes. So there's no, I guess, set answer with that again, but just looking at the metrics here, you would see that, you know, the target impressions and target reach inventory sets might yield a bit more favorable TRPs, but
comparatively
to the
to
other
the
set.
three,
But then again, of course, your index is almost at 100 points lower, 75 points lower. So it's
so it's maybe
the
could be 6 1, half
prioritization
dozen
of
to
those
be
metrics for the client.